everyone. Welcome to Revolutions Reconsidered, a deeper dive into the American Revolution. This season, we're focusing on the podcast Worlds Turned Upside Down, unpacking some of the sources, stories, and contributions that make up the show. I'm Dr. Lynn Price-Robbins, and I'm joined by Dr. James Ambuske, creator of Worlds Turned Upside Down. Hey, Jim.
Howdy.
So today we're talking about episode 5, which is called The Uprising. And it explores the growing agitation in the North American colonies following the 7 Years' War. So it's never really calm and peaceful and happy in the North American colonies anywhere near this time period. And so
Since.
Yeah. Let's just say it never was and never will be. So a few episodes ago, we were talking about the 7 Years' War. And we talked about how in the U.S. we call it the French and Indian War. And the issue with that was it makes it sound like Indian, this title Indian, is just one cohesive group.
Right.
And how that's very much incorrect. And one of the differences we have is language, which is absolutely fascinating. And that's something we never really hear about or talk about, certainly not in school, is the linguistic diversity of the indigenous population in the British North American colonies. So can you give us a little bit of background on this?
Yeah, it's a great thing that we need to keep in mind, right? When we're writing histories of early America in the United States, we're by and large writing those in English. And so you can kind of get lulled into a false sense of security that in the 18th century, everybody spoke English.
Right.
But that was far from the case. And I think a really great example of a way to think about this is the 1758 Treaty of Easton, that where the Lynn and Lenape, the Delaware, decide to withdraw from the war and abandon the French, which makes, in large measure, British victory possible from there on out. You know, at that conference, there are the Delawares, there are the Shawnee, there are representatives from each of the Six Nations Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee. There are other peoples as well who are present. All of them speak either different languages entirely or different dialects within their respective cultures. Plus, you've got the British representatives who are speaking English, and you've probably got some German missionaries who are there as well, who have been working with native peoples. So you can imagine this conference, and these conferences take a while because indigenous diplomatic protocol demands that anyway, but it's also taking a while because there are translators right and left translating indigenous languages for other indigenous people, translating English for indigenous people, going back and forth. So you can imagine this cacophony, this linguistic cacophony in the 18th century that I think escapes us. And it's important to really keep in mind because language is connected to culture, and the different ways we speak and also intimate different ideas is connected to cultural backgrounds. And so all of these conversations that people are having this period have very meaningful impacts on the course of events that move forward. So it's a very remarkable place, and we can never really get back to it, but we have to do our best to try to reconstruct it.
Right. And I think any of us who have used a translation app online know that it's never a one-to-one and that it's always a sort of loose translation, and words sometimes have meanings that are, very different from how another culture might use that term.
Right.
So it's not just interpreting someone else's words, but it's almost the meaning behind those words. So I can imagine when you have a whole group of people with different cultures and languages, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, I think you said it quite well, right? You're not only translating language, you're translating meaning.
Right.
And a lot can get lost in translation during that process.
Right. And we have an absolutely fascinating audio clip, a bonus for our audience. So can you introduce us to it?
Yeah, this is a clip from an interview we conducted with Dr. Maeve Kane at the University of Albany. And she told us a lot about Haudenosaunee culture and history and Haudenosaunee gender and trade in the 18th and 19th centuries. But as we were talking to her, I think, I can't remember who asked the follow-up question, but it kind of occurred to us, can you give us a sense of what it was like linguistically? Like, what would have people have been hearing? And so the clip that we're playing now is from her talking about the experiences of a British trader who was actually Dutch named Jelles Fonda, and the kinds of cultural encounters he would have had when he's dealing with native peoples, but also European settlers on the ground.
Great, let's roll that clip.
The Six Nations themselves all have distinct and different languages. The Ongwedekwaha are the languages of the Six Nations, and they're distinct, but they're mutually intelligible. Like somebody who speaks Seneca could, which is the farthest westernmost nation, could understand somebody who's speaking in Mohawk. In the 18th century, they're starting to be written. There's not a lot written, but there is some writing. And their orthographies, or their systems of writing, start to diverge. The way that something's spelled in Seneca is different than how it's spelled in Onondaga, is different than how it's spelled in Mohawk. And then there's dialects within nations. Again, mutually understood, but distinct dialects of Eastern and Western Mohawk that persist to today. Like you go to Aguasasne is different from the dialect from some of the other Mohawk reserves. And then interfacing with settlers, yet more languages. To give like one really specific example, one of the best sources that I work with, or one of my favorite sources, is this account book of a trader named Jelles Fonda, who's the ancestor of Peter and Jane and all of the other Fondas. Jelles Fonda is Dutch ancestry. He moves from kind of the Albany area into what is then the far limits of white settlement in the Mohawk Valley in the 1730s, 40s or so. He's surrounded by German settlers. So he's a Dutch guy with German neighbors. He's selling to all of the Six Nations who are speaking 6 distinct dialects within those nations. He's got French trade contacts. He's barely literate himself. He speaks English and writes a bunch in English. So a bunch of his account books, which are one of the best sources that we have for like what were Haudenosaunee people buying and therefore wearing, is this horrible mix of this English second language guy whose first language is Dutch. He's hearing a bunch of German. He's selling French goods, and he's trying to write down Haudenosaunee names. And then he also like crosses stuff out once he's done selling something. So it's a big pain to read. In one document, you get this layers of, this is one community that's less than 200 people. And there's all of these different languages being spoken. And people think of that area now as like, it's upstate New York. But in the 18th century, it was like the crossroads of the globe.
So I find it really interesting that Dr. Kane is not just talking about languages, but she's talking about dialects. So Can you talk a little bit about that? And is this a really important distinction to make? How do you feel about this?
Yeah, I think so, because dialects like language are reflective of culture. Mm-hmm. And so the easiest one I think we can grasp is the Six Nations Haudenosaunee. Mm-hmm. So the Seneca, Onondaga, the Oneida, Cayuga, and Mohawk, and Tuscarora, they're all Iroquoian-speaking peoples. Mm-hmm. But they all speak different dialects. And dialects we can think about as being specific to a region and a particular cultural variance. So they can all understand each other, mm-hmm. but they're speaking in ways that are relevant, that are specific to their geographies, to their own cultural heritages. I guess a concrete example is that, for example, someone who grows up in Boston is going to use certain phrases, certain variations of English that are going to be very different than someone who grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, right, from someone who grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so we're all speaking English, presumably for this example, mm-hmm. but our geographic and cultural experiences inflect in different ways the way that we actually communicate. Now, I think, of course, the ubiquity of technology and communication has probably reduced some of those cultural variances mm-hmm. to a degree in the 21st century, but in the 18th century, they probably would have been very pronounced for sure.
Absolutely, because you think today we can talk to pretty much anyone instantaneously on the internet.
Right.
Whereas back then you're in your local bubble. And so when you start to encounter different people, excuse me, it's must definitely have been a shock in a way that we just wouldn't understand today.
Right. I think so. It's something that's we can write about, but we can never truly understand, I think, unfortunately.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about Jelles Fonda, who at first I thought would be spelled like, jealous.
Exactly.
And I looked and I said, okay, good. It's not spelled like, but it sure sounds like, he's jealous.
Right.
So that very interesting name. I like it. So his Dr. Kane talks about his account book, which is awesome for so many reasons. I've worked with account books. I absolutely love them. I'm not a math person, but I love what they can tell you. And so she talks about all of these languages and dialects in this one region. But then she also talks about how this account book shows how the trade this region is doing is actually global. So Can you sort of give us some examples of what we learn from this account book?
Yeah, it was really fascinating when she was talking to us about Jelles Fonda, who, by the way, she also told us is the ancestor of Peter and Jane Fonda. So
that's wild.
So that's also kind of crazy. But he's operating in places like Kanajahari or Fort Hunter in northern New York. And as our listeners heard, right, he's Dutch born, but he's also knows English, badly knows French. He's also dealing with German settlers. But then he's also dealing with various native peoples who speak different languages or different dialects. And so his account book is this kind of weird, and I think she said the word she used was horrible to read because it's this mishmash of different languages and whatnot, and trying to parse all those out. But what you can glean from that then is the kinds of things that people are ordering. And as people will hear in the episode of Worlds Turned Upside Down, Dr. Kane talks about how indigenous buying habits reshape the global economy, such that Jelles Fonda is sending orders to Europe for particular kinds of cloth or particular colors of cloth that his indigenous customers want to buy that are not necessarily the same things that European settlers want to buy. And that kind of blew our minds when she talked about that in our interview and also in the episode, that we know trade was significant. But we only think about really that trade in relation to the fur trade.
Right.
And often it's lost on us or lost in the public's imagination about what indigenous peoples are actually getting in return. And what they're getting in return is in part dictating what manufacturers in London or Glasgow or Holland are actually producing. And that's pretty remarkable, I think. And it shows that the 18th century North America is much more global than we often think of, and that the cultural inflection of trade in this period is also having an economic effect in ways that most people probably don't really think about or understand.
Absolutely. And I think the most fascinating part to me was the clothing, because I feel like we today have a very distinct vision of what we think indigenous peoples looked like and what they wore in the 18th century. And it sounds like not only is European trade impacting how they would look and portray themselves, but they were impacting European trade based on how they wanted to portray themselves. So can you talk a little bit about how their perceptions and how their culture would have been impacted just on clothing, which is very important to indigenous peoples?
Yeah, I think what's really fascinating is, they're buying this cloth that they can remake into their own kind of unique styles and whatnot. But what I think is also, and Dr. Kane points this out in our episode, she says, it's as important of what they're not buying as what they are buying.
Right.
So they're not buying hats or they're not buying hard sole shoes, which are seen as sort of distinctly settler. So they are buying cloth to make leggings that will allow them, to cover themselves at the appropriate times of year. Other kinds of cloth, red cloth at times that they can shape and fashion into particular garments, but also metal objects that they're then adorning themselves with, but then remaking those in distinctly indigenous ways that reflect their particular cultural variances or valences. And so you start to get a better sense. And we don't have as many images, unfortunately, depictions as we would like. But if you begin to look at the differences between these idealized depictions of indigenous peoples that John White drew in the 16th century to depictions you start to see of various indigenous chiefs in the 18th century when they are negotiating with governors, or they'll come to Williamsburg or Philadelphia and they'll get a portrait painted. You begin to see how they have incorporated different elements of European textiles and whatnot into their cultures, but then remade them into specific ways that reflects the things that are important to them.
That is absolutely fascinating. And so I'm thinking about, we have all of these languages, we have all these dialects, we have a global trade, so that it's very much international nature.
Right.
So why is all of this such an important foundation when we talk about this unrest that's going on in the North American colonies?
Right. So there's two things we ought to think about when we imagine the end of the 7 Years' War from the indigenous perspective, particularly those peoples in the Ohio Country that we've talked about before. One is that when Montreal capitulates in 1760, and then when the European powers sign a treaty of peace in 1763, indigenous peoples are not party to those treaties. So Montreal capitulates in 1760, indigenous peoples are not there. New France is ceded to the British in 1763 formally through the Treaty of Paris, essentially giving the British the right to claim lands all the way to the Mississippi River, essentially ceding indigenous lands without their permission. So they don't have a seat at the table. So there's that issue. What also with the French gone, they no longer have a counterbalance to the British. So before, right, indigenous peoples could play the British and French off of each other. They could vie with them to get better prices for goods. With the French gone, that's no longer possible. And as the British begin to assert control of these spaces, they begin to change the rules a little bit, particularly General Jeffrey Amherst, who's commander-in-chief at this point in 1760 onward, starts to restrict trade, starts to tell the Indian agents like Sir William Johnson that you really shouldn't be giving indigenous peoples presents or gifts as part of diplomatic customs because it's really expensive. This is a huge charge against the king's account. So it begins to destabilize the relationship between the British and indigenous peoples. And they feel like they've been cheated out of their lands, or, potentially will be cheated out of their lands. They feel like the prices of goods are way too high relative to what they're used to getting. But they also recognize, and it's a self-awareness, that they have integrated European goods and ideas into their societies to such the extent that if they're withdrawn, it becomes very difficult for them to function as they might normally. So if you stop giving ammunition and guns as presents, as is customary in places like South Carolina and elsewhere, you do that, it makes it more difficult for them to hunt, particularly prepare for the winter. So the British, in a sense, begin to change the rules, and that destabilizes much of the interior, such that some indigenous peoples believe that resistance through force is the only way to restore their lifeways, to restore their lands, and some of them decide that the best thing we have to do is drive the British back over the mountains.
So on that note, Jim, can you introduce us to Pontiac?
Pontiac is an Odawa leader, and we don't know much about him before 1763. Okay. He was probably born in an Odawa village somewhere in western Lake Erie in the early 18th century. Probably fought in the 7 Years' War on the side of the French against the British, and certainly shared the frustrations of a lot of indigenous peoples like the Odawa and the Ojibwe about the kind of changes that are taking place in the post-7 Years' War period. He has become the kind of central figure we recognize as leading a pan-indigenous alliance against the British, beginning in May of 1763, when they begin to attack Forts Detroit and Pitt and other places. And he's a person that also, particularly General Thomas Gage, who becomes very important later in the Revolutionary period, begrudgingly respects in many ways. They see him as a very powerful and influential figure, but it's often the case that we kind of lose sight of a lot of the other indigenous leaders who were taking part in what becomes known as Pontiac's War, Pontiac's Conspiracy, Pontiac's Rebellion. But does become a very influential leader. And in part, he can become that leader because he is taking advantage of or leveraging the vision of a Delaware prophet named Neolin, who sometime in 1760, 61, 62 has an encounter with the Master of Life. And so the easiest equivalence is God. And the Master of Life tells Neolin that indigenous peoples have been corrupted by European influence. They should not have allowed them to live on their lands, and that the only way to restore their lifeways, restore their lands, is to attack the British and send them back across the Appalachian Mountains. That message spreads throughout the Ohio country into the Illinois countries. Pontiac is able to use that to great effect to marshal this alliance together that for a time is extraordinarily effective in achieving its goals.
And just like we had talked about earlier in this episode about words versus meaning,
right.
I was thinking about how, today we're such a textual society. There's, constant news, emails, texts. Everything is being,
right.
A lot of things are being communicated this way and instantaneously and to different cultures. And I think one thing that we've all learned is important is who to trust, and that words matter, and what words you choose can make a very big difference in the meaning of what you're trying to communicate. I've always heard of it as Pontiac's War, but apparently it was called other things, and those things very much impacted how someone would understand what actually happened. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. Well, I have to say, Lynn, that entire passage sequence in the episode was inspired by our conversation about the names of the French and Indian War, because I wanted a way to sort of communicate to the audience that the words we use communicate different ideas.
Right.
So a very famous early historian was called Francis Parkman in the 1850s, wrote these sweeping narrative histories, but they were a product of their time. And he called it the conspiracy of Pontiac, as if it was a kind of criminal organization or criminal element that was trying to undermine legitimate authority. Other historians have called it Pontiac's rebellion. And so if you think of the word rebellion, right, it implies that you are rebelling against someone to whom you owe allegiance or you have sworn allegiance. Right. And that, so for example, the Confederacy in the 1860s, they are rebelling against the United States, and the United States being the legitimate authority, and to a constitution to whom former Confederates had sworn at a previous moment in their lives. But also, as you say, you've always heard it as Pontiac's War. And it shouldn't be rebellion because Pontiac and the other indigenous peoples aren't subordinate to the British state. And they understood that, and they knew that, and the British knew that. They very much thought themselves as independent peoples. And so I think war is the better terminology, in part because it suggests a conflict between nation states. We have to be careful with the term nation states because that conception of a nation state doesn't map particularly accurately onto indigenous communities, but it's the best approximation when we're thinking about this. Right. So you have peoples, you have nations who have not been party to a treaty, whose lands have been ceded by the French to the British. And the decision is we see ourselves as independent peoples. We're going to go to war to defend our sovereignty and our rights. So it's not a rebellion. It's not a conspiracy. It is a war as we would understand it.
Right. And so essentially it's the person who is discussing this event who puts the label on it and therefore is able to sort of shape the narrative of Pontiac and his actions as well. And I think this certainly made me think about an important lesson in studying history, in understanding culture and context and the words that we use and the words that we choose. And I wanted to finish up this episode on a sort of big question, make you think a little bit. And when I was thinking about this, listening to the episode, the phrase that came to my mind was, history is always written by the victors, because it wasn't it wasn't Pontiac and it wasn't his ancestors who are calling his actions these different words.
Mhm.
So do you think that history is written by the victors, and what can we do about that as historians?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's like the almost the Obi-Wan Kenobi answer. It's a certain point of view, really, because if you're the British, if you are British Americans, then Pontiac's war really does look like a rebellion, because a lot of those folks would have thought that indigenous peoples were subordinate to them. Mm-hmm. I think oftentimes you see the victors getting the first crack at history. I think that's always, certainly that is the case in the history of the American Revolution, because the narratives that start coming out almost immediately is that it is the birth of a nation state. It is a birth of a nation state in defense of rights and liberties. But the entire premise of the show that we're doing is, as we talked about in our first conversations or so, is that we see this as an empire falling apart. Right. That's the story we should be telling. So what can we do about it? Well, we can tell many and very different stories that reshape how we understand the past, and bring different voices to the table. We still have to figure out and answer the big question of what happened and why. But if we can bring these different experiences to bear and bring these different sources to bear, we can have a better, richer understanding that can help us understand the contingent moments that led from A to B, how the course of history was suddenly rapidly redirected from its what seemed like an inevitable direction. And we can also begin to tell, sort of not counter narratives, but we can also begin to tell stories and histories of people who may not have been involved in the central events or the big stories that we're telling, but whose lives were nonetheless richer and rich, and were living lives of their own that may have had nothing to do with the sort of quote unquote big narrative, but who are making history in their own right. And, they have something to tell us as well.
Well, this was completely unintentional on my part, but that was a great advertisement for Worlds Turned Upside Down. I feel like we can use that and say, this is why this podcast is so important, because it's telling those other stories.
Well, great. I've done my job then, and I should have lunch.
You've earned it. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jim. This has been a really, really fascinating episode. We're always delighted with the insights you can give us to the episodes of Worlds. And of course, everyone should check out Worlds Turned Upside Down, which they can find everywhere podcasts are found, right?
Oh, yes.
And feel free to binge, go back and listen to them again, listen to them lots of times.
Yeah, if you don't know how to do a podcast or subscribe to a podcast, drop me an email. We can Zoom. I'll show you how to hit that subscribe button. I'll show you how to hit that 5-star button as well.
He'll tell you how to write a review and what to say.
Exactly.
Whatever you need, Jim is here for you.
Exactly.
So thank you so much for being here, and thanks to our listeners. And quick shout out to Too Complicated for History, a co-host. I'm co-host with Isaac Loftus, and historic birthdays today. We have all sorts of good things going on. So check out Primary Source Media, our website, and we now have a Patreon as well. So if you like kind of behind the scenes things and things that not everyone else gets to see, come over and check us out as well. And hopefully, we'll see you again soon, and we'll be seeing Jim soon, and we'll talk about episode 6. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks. We'll see you next time. You've been listening to Revolutions Reconsidered with Dr. Lynn Price Robbins and Dr. Jim Ambuske. Revolutions is a co-production of Primary Source Media and R2 Studios, part of the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. Our producers are Patrick Long, Jeanette Patrick, Lynn Price Robbins, and Jim Ambuske. Join the revolution by heading to primarysourcemedia.com or find Primary Source Media on YouTube. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.